pivot a bit back to the war with Iran, because I think that the Russians, as well as the Chinese and even the Iranians, were a bit surprised by their success against the United States, because well, the US is immensely powerful, and one would have assumed that yeah, the Iranians wouldn't have come out on top. At least this was the assumption for many people. So how do you explain this? How can the US lose this war essentially?
Well, let me just say that I think before the war started, if you go back to February 27th, the day before the war started, I think almost everybody thought that the Iranians would do reasonably well, but hardly anybody thought that they would do as well as they have done. I think the Iranians themselves are surprised by how well they have done. I'm surprised. I mean, I thought all along the Iranians would do very well. I thought they would shut the Strait of Hormuz, but I did not fully appreciate how well Iran would do in the fighting. Now, what's going on here? I think there's sort of two dimensions. One is the Strait of Hormuz. They have shut the Strait of Hormuz, and the United States has been unable to alter that situation. The United States, despite all Trump's rhetoric, has not been able to reopen the strait. And it's quite clear that Iran is now going to control the strait forever. And I don't think anybody fully appreciated just how extensive Iran's ability would be to shut down the strait, and how neutralized the Americans would be in the process. So I think that's point one. I think the more important point in terms of why we were surprised has to do with missiles. I think going back to the 12-day war in June of 2025, this is when Iran fought against the United States and Israel in a short 12-day war. It was quite clear then that Iranian missiles were quite effective, but the war was quite short. It was only 12 days, and the propaganda in the West was sufficient to disguise the fact that those ballistic missiles that the Iranians had were deadly effective. And of course, after the 12-day war in June 2025, the Iranians learned lessons, and they went out and they improved their ballistic missile capability, and they improved their drone capability. So when the war started on February 28th, the Iranians had a huge arsenal of ballistic missiles and drones, and those ballistic missiles were deadly accurate and had high explosive warheads. So they could do an enormous amount of damage. And what we have discovered as the war has worn on, and here I'm talking about the war that started on February 28th, is that the Iranian missile capability and drone capability gives them a significant advantage over the United States and Israel in this war. This is why we stopped the air war after 40 days. This is why we can't win the tit-for-tat campaign. You know, if you listen to the Americans and their Gulf allies talk, it seems like they shoot down every incoming Iranian ballistic missile and knock down every Iranian drone, and hardly any of those Iranian weapons get through to the target. But there's enough footage coming out now that makes it clear that this is not true, and that the Iranians are pounding Bahrain, pounding Kuwait, pounding Jordan, and so forth and so on. This Iranian missile capability is truly awesome. And you marry that to their drone capability, and you see that the Iranians are in a position where they have more coercive leverage over us than we have over them. And I don't think that people fully appreciated that before the war. I mean, we knew, again, from the 12-day war last year that those Iranian ballistic missiles were quite formidable. But I don't think we fully appreciated just how formidable that inventory of Iranian missiles and drones really is. And we have now found out. So I think what's really allowed the Iranians to do so well against the Americans and against the Israelis is, number one, the fact that they control the Strait of Hormuz, and we can't take that control away from them. And number two, they have this truly impressive arsenal of drones and ballistic missiles.
Well, how do you think this, again, taking a step back, this fits then within the wider I guess, the geostrategic picture for the United States? Because most of the US-led security architecture in the world seems to be aimed towards containing primarily three big countries. That is, in Europe, of course, we have NATO, which has the purpose of containing and weakening the position of Russia. In East Asia, there's also an elaborate security architecture for the US to contain China. And in the Middle East, of course, the US cooperation with the Gulf states is intended to, well, not just weaken, but also defeat Iran. Now, on this wars now against Iran and Russia, we saw that, at least the way I read it, was the objective of the US with the war on Russia since 2014 has been to knock out Russia so they can focus on China instead, using Ukrainians to knock out Russia. Keith Kellogg, he said this in very clear words, but you also heard it from many other American leaders. It didn't work. Instead, we saw Russia and China get closer than ever. Now the objective seemingly was to knock out Iran. Yes, it would have deprived Russia of an important partner, but I think it would have weakened China to a much larger extent. But now, will the Iranians link themselves closer as well to Russia and China? I mean, they have their own issues between them, so I guess there's limits to how far this can go. But how do you see the wider, I guess, geostrategic picture shifting as a result of this war? Because the defeat in Iran it just seems like this would transform a lot of geopolitics. As you said before, the security architecture, the security umbrella of the US would be weakened. Well, at least in East Asia, also to some extent in Europe, and definitely in the Middle East. But meanwhile, you would have these other Eurasian powers getting closer than ever. Or do you see, is it too premature to say?
It is awfully early in the game. There's no question about that. But let me make a couple observations. First of all, I think that before February 28th, the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians had powerful incentives to work together to deal with the United States. I think before February 28th, it was clear that the United States was an adversary of all three of those countries. The United States was much more powerful than Iran and Russia, and even more powerful than China. And therefore, it made sense for those three countries to coordinate. I think since February 28th, since the war started, the incentives for those three countries to work together have increased greatly. As we just talked about, President Trump, starting in mid-June when he went to the G7 conference, and then when he went in early July to the NATO conference, made it quite clear that he, President Trump, was putting his crosshairs once again on the Russians, that he was not adhering to the spirit of Anchorage and instead was looking to inflict punishment on Russia. So the Russians today clearly understand that they have a powerful incentive to help Iran, and the Chinese have figured that out as well. And those two countries, China and Russia, have been helping Iran. They have been providing Iran with extensive intelligence, and they have providing Iran with military equipment. And that situation is likely to continue in the future because, again, those three countries, and you could add North Korea to the mix, have a vested interest in working together to balance against the United States, which is an enemy of all three of those countries, or all four if you want to include North Korea. And I don't believe that's going to change anytime soon. With regard to a continuation of the war, I think you could make an argument that from China's point of view and from Russia's point of view, the longer the United States remains pinned down in this war in Iran, the better it is for those two great powers. If I were playing China's hand, I would be content to see the United States mired in an endless conflict in the Persian Gulf. I would not want to see the United States end its military presence in the Persian Gulf and pivot full force to East Asia. That's not in my interest if I'm China. What I want to do is, if I'm China, keep the United States pinned down in the Middle East. And by the way, keep the United States pinned down in the Ukraine war. The more weapons that the United States gives to Ukraine, the less weapons they have to use in East Asia to contain China. So I think if you just sort of look at this war and what's happening, number one, it drives Iran, China, and Russia close together. It gives them powerful incentives to help each other deal with the Americans. And at the same time, it gives the Chinese and the Russians a powerful incentive to keep the United States pinned down in the Middle East so as to minimize the amount of trouble that the United States can cause in East Asia or in Ukraine.
Yeah, I remember from the Russian side, when the war in Syria was going on, one objective of Russia was to have this very limited cooperation they had with Iran to try to build on it, to overcome some historical mistrust, and essentially build on it to develop a strategic partnership. And of course, then after Russia invaded Ukraine and the Iranians stepped in to help, this grew further. And then, of course, the US went to war with Iran. Then and the Russians assisted, as well as the Chinese. This partnership only strengthened and strengthened. It seems like this has been a terrible, terrible mistake on the side of the United States to bring these powers, which used to have much more daylight between them, to bring them this close together. But you keep mentioning all the weapons that would have been sent to Asia or sent to Europe, which is now going to the Middle East. But as the US is ramping up in all these wars at the same time, you see the same logic in Europe. There's a idea that now they have to arm themselves to the teeth. Is it possible that the military capabilities will increase even though they have more military ambition? Because if the situation demands it, isn't it possible? It wouldn't be problematic for the Chinese, for example, if the US, the Europeans now for years just prioritize building up huge arsenals of weapons because, well, again, I'm not sure how serious the inventory problem is in the United States.
Well, the Europeans and the Americans are different actors from China's point of view. China doesn't really care whether the Europeans build up their military capability because the Europeans are not going to engage the Chinese militarily in any meaningful way. These European militaries are talking about building up their forces to deal with Russia, not to deal with China. They're going to be focused laser-like on what they see as the Russian threat. The Americans are a completely different story because the Americans view China as what they call the pacing threat, the greatest threat that the United States faces. And the United States is interested in building up military forces in East Asia to contain China. And many people in the U.S. national security establishment see a commitment to Ukraine as a drain on resources for East Asia. And the same, of course, is true with the Middle East. So you have a different incentive structure for the Europeans and the Americans, and the Chinese view the Europeans and the Americans in very different ways. Just to go to the Europeans for a second, I kind of don't understand exactly what they're doing. I mean, they're building up their own military capability because they say they're sort of getting ready for war with Russia, which they seem to think is inevitable. Are the Europeans really going to fight in Ukraine against Russia? I find that hard to believe. I think what the Europeans want to do is they want to use the Ukrainians as a battering ram. The reason the Europeans are not serious about negotiating a settlement to the Ukraine war is because the Europeans are not dying. They're using the Ukrainians for that purpose. And the Ukrainians are foolish enough to go along with this bizarre approach, right? So the Europeans say to the Ukrainians, just keep fighting, we'll give you money, we'll give you weapons. And Ukraine is bleeding to death in the process. But the Europeans are not dying. And I find it hard to believe that the Europeans are going to build up military capability that's designed to fight against the Russians. I don't think the Russians want to fight against the Europeans for 1 second. And I think in the final analysis, the Europeans are not going to want to fight against the Russians. They're going to want the Ukrainians to do that. Well, if that's the case, and you're a European, shouldn't you just build up your industrial base, produce more weapons, and give those weapons to the Ukrainians so that they can continue to do the fighting? That seems to be, in good part, what the Europeans are doing these days. I don't know about the long term, but for the moment, they want to get more weapons to Ukraine. But the real problem is that it's really not weapons that the Ukrainians need. What they need is manpower. They need soldiers on the front line. But you don't see the Europeans rushing to send soldiers to Ukraine to fight on the front line. And this all raises the question of how long Ukraine can last without more soldiers. So I think the Europeans will build up their weaponry and they'll build up their fighting forces. But I think before they achieve significant levels of weapons producing capability, and before they build their actual force,